All right, so I'm going to talk about texture. Texture is incredibly important. So basically, when you buy your sheet of metal, it's going to be smooth. It's going to have the texture from being manufactured in a sheet metal production facility, and you can kind of see sometimes it has these little striations from the rollers from being rolled down to the thickness that you bought it. That's not a very nice texture. So most of the time, at the very least, we're going to have a sanded finish or even a polished finish. But you can go way beyond that. The great thing about metal is you can create really inviting textures quite simply. And so I'm going to go through just a few different ways to achieve texture. There's many more, but you can use texture to draw attention to certain areas. You can use texture to create contrast in your surface. Having a contrast in texture is usually something that you want to strive for. So it's not just the same surface throughout. If it's the same surface throughout your entire piece and there's no change, people will be less likely to want to investigate that object. If they see that there's contrast on that surface, areas of light and dark, automatically we want to investigate that object a little bit more. One of the most common ways to achieve texture is with a hammer. By hammering our metal, we're essentially putting many little dents in the surface of that metal. And if you're consistent and you can really control how you're hammering, you're going to have a very effective texture. Now I have a selection of hammers here, and all of the hammers in this studio are really designed to do something different. And so the forming hammers, these are all either sinking or embossing hammers. These are all meant to create a hemispherical depression in that metal and to move that metal in essentially all directions at the same time. So when I hit, all that energy is radiating out in all directions. If I have a different shaped hammer, like let's say this little riveting hammer that has this nice little cross peen, that's only moving the metal in two directions. It moves the metal perpendicular to the direction of that cross. This will give me a little bit of a line shaped dent. If you want to move the metal without creating texture, you want to use a hammer that's a softer material than what you're hitting. And so that's why we have all benches should have a small rawhide mallet in the bench, but then we also have these bigger rawhide mallets, and we have plastic mallets. There's wood mallets down there and things of that sort. And then we have our ball peen hammers, right? And so ball peen hammers are kind of one of the workhorses when it comes to hammers. This is a very heavy hammer. You can see it's really beat up. So whatever texture is in the face of that hammer, that will get transferred to your metal. So if I choose a really clean, polished hammer, such as this embossing hammer, I'm going to get a really clean circular mark. If I choose something like this ball peen hammer that's really beat up, I'm going to transfer these dents. They're going to show up as little bumps in my metal. Now that's a really great thing if you want that to happen. It's a really terrible thing if you don't. So really scrutinize the face of the hammer and experiment. Experiment with different hammers and see what they do. One thing we want to be certain of is that we never use any of our forming hammers on steel. So I have a piece of steel here, and the steel will cause damage to these hammers. If you want to work with the steel and you need to do something with a hammer, you have to use a ball peen hammer or a cross peen hammer. I typically say the old standby is if you've seen that hammer in the hardware store, you can use it on steel. If you're ever curious about how to identify if you have a piece of steel, rule number one is it's going to be really hard. Steel is a very rigid material, but also steel is the only metal in this studio that will rust. So if you pick up something and it's rusty, be careful with it. Another way to double check if it's steel or not is to attach a magnet to it. We have all kinds of magnets floating around this studio for this very reason. And so very often the magnets are stuck to one of the support poles. There's magnets stuck to the steel part of the drill on the drill press, just so that we can make sure that we know if we're working with steel or not. So to create my hammer texture, I want to put my piece of metal down on a clean anvil surface. Now our anvils in here are in pretty good shape, but there's still some areas that have some marks. What you need to understand is every time I hit the metal with a hammer, the anvil is hitting it from the other side. So if there's all kinds of marks and scratches and dents and things in the surface that you're working on, that's going to be transferred into your metal. Now you can do this on any anvil surface in the studio. And so any clean steel surface counts as an anvil surface. I would not recommend doing hammer texture on your steel bench blocks. It's just going to be obnoxiously loud. So what I can do is, now I'm trying to be consistent, and I'm trying to lay those hammer blows right on top of one another. Okay, so this is hammer texture. It's consistent. Those are dents, okay? There isn't consistency. There's a lot of space between them. It's very difficult to see the texture right now because I don't have any patina on this piece of metal. Therefore, everything is the same tone. It's the same value. And so, so it's reflecting the same light. So it's kind of difficult to see. One thing that you will notice is there is some deformation of the material. That's what this hammer is intended to do. This hammer is intended to move and shape metal. So if you want it to stay flat, you have to periodically use a rawhide mallet and flatten that out. What I would recommend is to experiment with different hammers. Different hammers are going to give you different marks. Now, when I am hitting this, I am allowing the weight of the hammer to do all the work. And basically, since I'm hitting directly against an anvil, that hammer is going to bounce back just a little bit. So theoretically, you should be able to do this all day and never get tired. Let's try the cross peen now. Now the great thing about the cross peen is it's directional. So I don't know if these are showing up or not, but you can see those little lines. You could use that cross peen to kind of simulate fur on an animal, or maybe like a field of grass or something like that. Now I'm going to use our beat up hammer. And I can see all of those scratches and marks that have been transferred. Now, it should be said that if you want to texture something all the way to the edge, you should do all of your texturing first and then cut that out. Because what happens is I didn't mention, you want to be really careful that you don't miss with our forming hammers. So if I textured all the way up to the edge, I'm gonna have some distortion in that edge, and I'm gonna have to clean it up and file it. So I'm kind of like doing work twice, and no one likes to work twice. I could take the side of my rivet hammer and get these little crescent moon shapes. Basically, any steel hammer in here can give you texture. Now, if you feel so inclined, you could go to the hardware store and buy a cheap ball-peen hammer and actually carve into the face of that hammer, and then that texture will be transferred to your metal too. If you do that with one of my hammers, I might feel tempted to carve into you. So don't alter our hammers. They make all kinds of texturing hammers and things of that nature. Another thing that you can do with a hammer is you can hammer texture into the metal. So if you recall, earlier I was talking about choosing to not work on a damaged area of the anvil. You might choose to hammer over something that is all rusty and corroded. I have this really nice rusty piece of railroad that has this really great texture, and I can hammer the copper into it. And so in order to do that, you just need a piece of material that has a texture to it. What I did was I grabbed this rusty piece of steel. It's a piece of angle, and it's pretty rusted. And so what I'm gonna do with my textured piece of metal is I'm actually gonna flip it over, because I want this texture to be in the face. And with a steel ball-peen hammer, I can start hammering that texture, and it gives a really interesting kind of like corroded or pitted texture to it. So in a minute, I am going to dunk this piece of metal into some liver of sulfur so that you can really see that texture, and I'll talk a little bit more about patinas. But there's another texture that I want to show. Another way to get texture in metal is to use this tool here. Now, this is a rolling mill. What is intended to do is to reduce the thickness of your metal. So let's say you bought some 18 gauge metal, and you want it to be thinner, 20 gauge, 22 gauge. You can use this tool to do that. Basically by tightening or loosening this knob, it raises and lowers the rollers, making them closer together or farther apart. We can use this to texture metal if we have something that has a texture to it. So I have this little paper heart that I cut out. The sketchbook paper has a tooth to it. So I can transfer the tooth of that paper into my metal. Now it's super, super important when you're using this that you sandwich whatever you're using as your texture between two pieces of metal. I don't want to roll and transfer the texture of the heart onto the roller, because then that heart will be imprinted in every single piece of metal that is rolled through this machine after. And so you can see it's a very effective way to get texture by transferring that tooth. There's a little fish that I made a long time ago. I can use other objects that have a texture. There's over by the drill press, there's a drawer marked roller print textures. And in that drawer, there's a bunch of pieces of fabric and things like that. I can transfer the texture of the fabric into my metal and do some really cool things. So in order to use this tool to transfer the texture of this leaf into my metal, I need to set this tool up. I also need to make sure that I don't have a piece of steel. So there should always be a magnet close by. Now I know these are pieces of copper, but if you're working with a gray metal, you might want to double check before you get started. And so non-magnetic, I'm good to go. So what I need to do is I need to set the depth first. So I'm going to loosen this up and then tighten it as tight as I can just with my hands. I'm going to back this out. Right now, that is set to the exact thickness of my 2 pieces of metal and my leaf inside. If I rolled this through, I would accomplish nothing. So what I want to do is give a quarter turn, not too much. If you go too much, you're just going to smash the crap out of whatever is in there. You just want to go a quarter turn. Now I'm a little more narrow than the thickness of my metal. I want to make sure it's going in straight, and I'm just going to So I was going to do a leaf, but then when I rolled it, I think I squeezed too much and I had a failure. Basically what happens when you're squeezing too much is you're going to stretch that metal. And whatever you're using for your texture is not going to stretch. And so in this case, I just went a little too much, and there you have it. So now I decided to draw this sun. And so one thing to keep in mind, the pen marks are not going to show up in my metal. So if you draw any detail and you don't cut it out, it's not going to be there. So once again, I'm going to sandwich my object between 2 pieces. Since I knew I took a little bit too much, I'm going to back it off slightly. Okay, that time was much more successful. So I don't know if you can see this or not, but I have my objects. I have 2 of them. You're always going to end up with 2. And I have a nice sort of embossed tooth of that paper. Something that happens when you roll is you are hardening your metal. And in order to get this so that I can flatten it out really easily, what I should do is I should anneal this. Basically what annealing is heating this piece of metal up to a proper temperature so that it realigns those molecules that have essentially been smashed into each other and makes that metal soft again. Normally in a class demonstration, I would hand this off to somebody and ask them to bend it, and they wouldn't be able to bend it. And then after I anneal it, I ask the same person, and then they bend it super easy. To anneal my metal, basically what I want to do is I want to heat this up until the metal gets rather dirty, and you'll be able to see a clean spot where the torch is hitting it. Wherever that torch is hitting it, it's going to be burning away the oxygen. The dirt that we see is oxidized metal. And so at the spot where the flame is, there is no oxygen, so it appears to be clean. What we are looking for when we anneal is we're looking for that clean area to dance behind where the flame is. So I have my striker, I have my torch. I'm going to light the torch, adjust my air. I'm going to turn this down just a little bit. Now we want a flame that's a little bit cigar shaped. We don't want that flame to be super sharp. So I'm heating up my first. You can start to see a clean spot where the flame is. And now I can see that flame, that clean spot kind of hesitating and dancing behind it. I'm heating up my second one. Just kind of gently moving the torch around it. You can see these really pretty rainbowy colors first. And if you were to quench that piece of metal when you have those rainbow colors, sometimes you can get them to stick around, and it's a very effective, it's called a heat patina. So you can see that hesitation. Now what we don't want to see is we don't want to see this metal glowing red. If it's glowing red, we've heated it up way too much. If we were to turn the lights off, if you were to anneal in the dark, these would have a very dull red glow to them, but we don't want to see it glowing bright. Now I'm going to quench and put it in the pickle.